In 1942, Allied soldiers in North Africa learned a hard truth. The enemy's tanks were changing faster than their guns. When German Panzer IVs appeared with long-barreled 75mm cannons and later, the first Tigers and Panthers, the balance of armor and firepower swung sharply in Germany's favor. Crews inside British Shermans and Churchills suddenly found themselves outranged, outgunned, and often destroyed before they could see their attacker. To the Americans, the answer was simple: build bigger guns. U.S. engineers began experimenting with 76 and 90mm weapons, powerful, but heavy, demanding new turrets, new mounts, and a re-engineered supply chain. Britain, however, was already fighting for its life. There was no time to start from scratch. What Britain needed was not a larger gun. It needed a smarter one, and fast. At the Royal Armament Research and Development Establishment in Fort Halstead, Kent, a team of engineers under Major Sir Harold Tate began sketching something radical. The new weapon had to pierce the front armor of a Tiger I at 1,000 yards, yet be light enough to move by lorry, and cheap enough to build in hundreds. Their solution was a 76.2mm high-velocity cannon using a slim, elongated case, firing a shell at 3,900 feet per second, nearly double the velocity of the existing 6-pounder. It was called the Ordnance quick-firing 17-pounder. Its arrival was not welcomed by everyone. Frontline commanders doubted whether such a large gun could ever fit inside existing tanks. The gun's recoil system alone was too long for the Sherman's turret ring, and the barrel overhung dangerously. But in Britain's arsenal of desperation, innovation often grew out of impossibility. By late 1942, early prototypes were firing on the ranges at Ardennes. Test rounds punched through captured panzer armor like cardboard. The engineers had solved the ballistic problem. Now, they had to solve the engineering one. A gun that worked in a field mount still had to be fitted into a tank that could reach the front in weeks, not years. Back in North Africa, crews of the 8th Army watched their 6-pounders bounce off the front of a Tiger's hull and realized how quickly the enemy had adapted. Reports flowed back to London warning that without a new anti-tank weapon, future landings, like the planned invasion of Europe, would be massacres. The War Office issued an order. The 17-pounder must reach the front by spring 1943. The Americans were building bigger guns. Britain would beat them to the battlefield. By Christmas 1942, the first production breeches were being machined in Woolwich, the barrels heat-treated and rifled at Royal Ordnance factories across England. As German engineers perfected the Panther, British workers on night shifts were forging the weapon that would one day kill it. And in those foundries, amid the clang of steel and the glow of molten metal, Britain's answer to the tank crisis was taking shape, smaller, faster to produce, but destined to change the war sooner. The spring of 1943 arrived with the 17-pounder still too large for any British tank. The gun worked beautifully in static tests, but its carriage and recoil mechanism made it impossible to mount inside the turrets of Shermans, Churchills, or Cromwells without major redesign. The Americans were already redesigning turrets for their new 76mm. Britain, under constant bombing and material shortage, didn't have that luxury. So the solution came not from a drawing office, but from a workshop floor. At the Royal Tank Workshops in Lulworth, a small group of engineers, led by Lieutenant Colonel George Wytheridge, decided to do the impossible: fit the gun into a standard American Sherman without waiting for permission. They removed the recoil guard, modified the breech block, and re-angled the gun so the back of the breech would just clear the commander's seat when firing. The result looked crude, but worked. The Sherman Firefly was born not through committee, but through stubborn practicality. It was an act of British improvisation at its purest, quick, resourceful, and quietly revolutionary. To keep balance, a massive counterweight was welded to the rear of the turret. To fit the new gun's long barrel, they had to move the radio into an armored box welded onto the turret's back, giving the Firefly its distinctive hump. Every inch of interior space was measured, every cable rerouted. Crews joked that the Firefly fired shells so fast it could shoot yesterday's target. Meanwhile, the first towed 17-pounder batteries were already crossing into Tunisia. There, against German Panzer IVs and Tigers, the new gun's potential was immediately apparent. At long range, it could destroy any tank on the battlefield. German crews who had once advanced with impunity suddenly found themselves burning before they could fire. Allied troops cheered each new battery arrival. Finally, the Tigers bled. Back in England, production scaled with wartime urgency. The War Office authorized a crash conversion program. Hundreds of Shermans were stripped and refitted across British depots. But the gun's length made shipping hazardous. Transport crews had to remove the barrel or attach a protective sleeve before rail or sea transit. Even so, by the time D-Day approached, nearly 600 Fireflies were ready for issue to armored divisions destined for Normandy. While the Americans pressed ahead with their 76mm upgrade, the British had done something that no other ally managed. They had leapfrogged the enemy's armor advantage through ingenuity alone. And unlike heavy designs still stuck in testing, the Firefly would fight within weeks. In staff meetings across Allied headquarters, the tone began to shift. Where once the Americans had questioned Britain's obsession with adaptation over size, they now watched as a homegrown gun rewrote battlefield math. It wasn't the biggest cannon, but it might prove the one that arrived in time to win. As June 1944 neared, rows of camouflage Fireflies waited at southern ports, their long barrels covered with canvas, and their crews briefed in secrecy. None of them knew that within days, this hybrid of British brain and American steel would become one of the deadliest tank killers of the war. When the invasion of Normandy began on June 6, 1944, few weapons represented Allied cooperation more perfectly than the Sherman Firefly. Its body was American, its heart unmistakably British. Yet most soldiers landing that morning had never seen one. The Firefly was still officially limited issue, held back to preserve secrecy and to prevent the Germans from realizing just how powerful a new threat was waiting across the Channel. In the first chaotic days after D-Day, British and Canadian armored regiments discovered quickly what that extra firepower meant. Where the standard 75mm Shermans struggled to penetrate even a Panzer IV's frontal armor, the 17-pounder punched straight through. Reports from Normandy described German crews abandoning tanks after a single Firefly round shattered their confidence, if not their armor. "A Firefly in the troop," one commander wrote, "means we fight the Tigers on even ground." But the Germans were watching too. Reconnaissance photographs soon revealed that a handful of Allied Shermans carried abnormally long barrels. The Wehrmacht nicknamed them Feuerfalter, fire butterflies, deadly but rare. Panzer commanders began ordering their gunners to target those tanks first. To counter this, British crews often disguised their guns by painting the outer half of the barrel in countershaded stripes, making the long weapon appear shorter at a distance. It was a visual trick that saved lives. The Firefly's baptism of fire came during Operation Charnwood and later, Goodwood, battles aimed at breaking out of the Normandy bridgehead. Among hedgerows and narrow lanes, tank duels often happened at shockingly short range. At one orchard near Villers-Bocage, a Firefly from the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry spotted a German Tiger commanded by Michael Wittmann, one of the most feared tank aces of the war. Accounts vary, but British reports claim a 17-pounder round struck the Tiger from nearly 800 meters, destroying it in seconds. Wittmann's death became a legend, and for the first time, German tank crews feared any Sherman they met. What made the Firefly so remarkable wasn't just its lethality, but how fast it appeared. From concept sketch to operational service had taken less than 18 months. By contrast, most new tank guns took years to move from prototype to production. The Americans were still refining the M36 Jackson and the Pershing. The Soviets were only just introducing their 85mm guns. Britain's 17-pounder had reached the field first and was already rewriting tactics. Crews learned to use it differently from ordinary Shermans. In every troop of 4 tanks, one Firefly took overwatch, using range and accuracy to cover the advance. Its tungsten-cored armor-piercing, discarding sabot rounds could reach out past 2 kilometers, piercing a Panther's glacis from angles the enemy thought safe. Against targets in cover, the gun's muzzle blast alone shattered windows and splintered trees. Normandy was its proving ground. The gun that engineers once doubted could even fit in a tank had become a reason Allied armor could move again as the Allied advance spread beyond the Normandy hedgerows. The 17-pounder's reputation grew with it. From the dusty lanes of Falaise to the forests of Holland, wherever German armor appeared, Fireflies and towed 17-pounder crews became the silent arbiters of survival. The weapon's velocity was so great that tank commanders often described the hit not as an explosion, but as a flash of white light, followed by a black column of smoke where a tiger had once stood. In the bocage fighting, range was often limited to a few hundred yards. The Firefly's long barrel made maneuvering difficult, yet its crews adapted quickly. They learned to angle hulls through gaps to reverse out of ambush points, and to fire from concealed positions along narrow sunken roads. Infantrymen soon recognized the sharp, thunder-like crack of its discharge. They knew that if the 17-pounder was speaking, their flank was safe. Further north, as Operation Market Garden began in September 1944, the gun's reach proved vital. When British paratroopers at Arnhem were cut off by advancing German armor, nearby armored units of the Guards Armored Division used Fireflies and self-propelled Achilles tank destroyers, each mounting the same 17-pounder, to hold open the corridor along the road to Nijmegen. One gun commander later recalled engaging a Panther at 1,200 yards and watching the shot pass clean through both sides of the tank. The Germans, who had once laughed at the Sherman as Tommy's lighter, now found it could punch harder than almost anything they fielded. But power had its price. The 17-pounder's blast and recoil were fierce. Inside the turret, the concussion made conversation impossible. Crews wore cotton in their ears and braced for each report. Spent casings filled the floor, hot to the touch, rolling underboots as loaders struggled to feed the long shells into the breech. Each round weighed nearly 20 pounds, and a skilled loader could manage 6 shots a minute only by muscle memory and pain tolerance. Yet those hardships were accepted willingly, because the men had finally regained what they had lacked since 1941, a weapon that could strike back. By the autumn of 1944, more than 2,000 Fireflies had been built, supplementing hundreds of towed 17-pounder guns and a small number of self-propelled variants like the Archer, which mounted the gun backward on a Valentine chassis. Each variant extended the weapon's reach, ensuring that British formations could engage German armor long before it threatened their infantry columns. Even American commanders took notice. General Omar Bradley described the Firefly as the most effective anti-tank Sherman in Europe. Requests for shared production soon followed, but by then the war's tempo had moved faster than bureaucracy. Britain's gun had already changed the balance. It didn't need to be big, it just needed to be ready. When winter fell and the snow-covered fields of Belgium echoed with tank engines again, the 17-pounder was waiting its cruise season, its ammunition improved, and its legend growing with every destroyed Tiger left smoldering in the frost. December 1944 brought one last brutal test for Allied armor. In the snowbound forests of the Ardennes, German panzers launched a desperate counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge. It was a final furious attempt to split the Allied lines and capture Antwerp. In those frozen valleys, where fog choked the air and tanks advanced through pine shadows, the 17-pounder again became Britain's most trusted ally. At first, the surprise attack hit thin American lines, where ordinary Shermans with 75mm guns struggled against the Panthers and Königssteigers of the 6th Panzer Army. But British and Canadian units positioned on the northern shoulder of the salient had already begun re-equipping with Fireflies. As the German spearheads swung toward the Meuse, these mixed formations provided the hard edge of the Allied reply. The 17-pounder's high-velocity shell was uniquely suited to winter fighting. In the cold air, its trajectory flattened further. At 1,500 yards, a tungsten round could still penetrate 140 millimeters of armor, enough to destroy any tank Germany could field. Reports from 29th Armored Brigade described Firefly crews lying in ambush along frozen hedgerows, waiting as Panthers emerged in column. The first shot from a concealed Firefly would light up the snow like a camera flash. The second never needed to be fired. By now, the gun's reputation had spread so widely that even infantry patrols marked their maps with Firefly call signs, requesting their support whenever enemy armor was sighted. The Germans feared the distinctive bark of the 17-pounder more than air attack. Survivors of Panzerlehr would later recall their crews refusing to advance if intelligence suggested Fireflies in the sector. What had once been a symbol of British improvisation had become a weapon of psychological dominance. Not every engagement was one-sided. In narrow roads and wooded glades, The Firefly's long barrel could betray its position. German infantry armed with panzers stalked their prey among the trees. Many Fireflies were lost not to tank duels, but to close-range ambushes, victims of the same tactical lessons they had taught their foes. Yet even in those moments, their crews inflicted damage far out of proportion to their numbers. One troop of the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment destroyed 7 German tanks in a single afternoon before withdrawing intact. When the Ardennes offensive finally broke apart under Allied counterattack, the gun story had become legend. Newspapers back home spoke of the British gun that stopped Hitler's last gamble. In quiet workshops across southern England, engineers reading those headlines understood how rare that praise was. They had taken a weapon that by all logic should not have existed, a cannon too large for any tank, and turned it into the tool that shattered Germany's final thrust. As the snow melted and the Allies crossed the Rhine, the 17-pounder rolled forward once more, still the same gun, still answering the same question. Could Britain, with fewer resources and smaller factories, build something that changed the war faster than anyone else? By the spring of 1945, the Allied army stood on the west bank of the Rhine, the last natural barrier before the heart of Germany. The crossings at Wesel-Rees and Remagen would demand everything the Allied tank crews had learned in years of war, and once again, the 17-pounder was at the center of it all. Across the river, German forces deployed their final reserves. Panthers from SS Panzer divisions hastily repaired Tiger IIs, and a scattering of Jag Panthers and assault guns. They were fewer than before, but still lethal. Many had been pulled from factory lines incomplete, lacking spare parts or fuel. Yet every intact Tiger still represented a deadly threat to any Sherman that came within view. To counter them, the British Second Army and Canadian First Army lined their armored brigades with Fireflies. Each troop commander knew that the first tank to spot the enemy often decided the fight. The 17-pounder's range advantage meant that British gunners could engage before the Germans reached effective distance. In open country along the Lower Rhine, engagements stretched past 1,500 yards, once unthinkable for Allied tanks. In several duels recorded near Xanten and Emmerich, single Fireflies knocked out multiple Panthers before they could return fire. Supporting them were self-propelled variants, the Achilles built on the American M10 tank destroyer chassis, and the Archer, a peculiar British design with the gun mounted backwards on a Valentine hull. The Archer looked awkward, but could reverse into cover, fire, and retreat without turning. In the confined lanes and forest tracks of northern Germany, this backward tank became one of the war's most effective ambush weapons. The final months also saw a quieter victory, logistical triumph. Britain had not only built a powerful gun, but had mastered mass production of high-velocity ammunition. The new armor-piercing discarding sabot, APDS, round double penetration while reducing weight, a rare engineering miracle at a time when most nations were running out of tungsten. With this ammunition, the 17-pounder could defeat a Tiger II from the flank and a Panther from the front, a feat no Allied field gun had achieved before. As the Allied columns advanced through the shattered Ruhr industrial belt, tank crews spoke of the Firefly with pride and affection. It was still a Sherman, cramped, noisy, and thin-skinned, but now it felt equal. In an army defined by cooperation, the Firefly symbolized partnership and urgency. British design grafted onto American steel, delivered not in theory, but in time. By April, as British armor crossed into the plains of northern Germany, the Luftwaffe was gone, the panzers burning on roadsides, and the 17-pounder had achieved what it was built to do: restore balance through speed and ingenuity. The Americans had indeed built bigger guns, but Britons had changed the war faster. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the 17-pounder had already earned its place in military history. In less than 3 years, Britain had designed, tested, and fielded a weapon that neutralized the best armor Germany could build. But its influence reached far beyond the battlefield. It represented a distinct British philosophy of warfare, that innovation, improvisation, and speed could outweigh industrial size. While American ordnance laboratories pursued their powerful 90mm cannon, and the Soviets perfected the 122mm gun on the IS-2, the British proved that victory did not depend solely on caliber. The 17-pounder, smaller in dimension but higher in velocity, offered a different lesson. Penetration and agility could be achieved through engineering precision rather than brute force. The Americans had numbers and industry. Britain had urgency and design genius. Comparisons were inevitable. In trials conducted after the war, Allied engineers tested captured German tanks against every major Allied gun. The results confirmed what soldiers had already learned in combat. The American 76 millimeters could penetrate the front of a Panther only at close range. The Soviet 85 millimeters did slightly better. The 90 millimeters gun of the M36 Jackson matched it, but none equaled the 17-pounder's consistency. Against the Panther's glassy, only the British round could reliably penetrate beyond 1,000 yards. Its superiority was not limited to tanks. Mounted on the Achilles, the 17-pounder made the M10 one of the most feared tank destroyers in Europe. In the Archer, it turned a light infantry support vehicle into a precision ambush weapon. Even aircraft designers studied its ballistics when developing high-velocity cannon for post-war jets. Yet the 17-pounder's story also revealed the limits of improvisation. It was never an easy gun to handle. Its long barrel overhung hedgerows and snagged on trees. Its recoil strained Sherman turrets, not built for such power. The ammunition was heavy, the flash blinding, and the blast deafening. But for the men who fought inside those cramped steel shells, none of that mattered. They knew what it felt like to face a tiger and live to tell the tale. By 1946, British engineers had already begun work on its successor, the 20-pounder, which would arm the Centurion, the tank that became a post-war benchmark for decades. Yet the DNA of that gun was pure 17-pounder. Long barrel efficiency, velocity over caliber, precision over size. The principles born in those Kent workshops during Britain's darkest hour now defined the post-war armor doctrine of NATO itself. Even in peacetime, the Firefly and its 17-pounder remained symbols of ingenuity under pressure. Museums displayed them not merely as machines, but as reminders of what a nation could achieve when it had no other choice but to innovate. The Americans built bigger guns, the Soviets built more tanks, but the British built the weapon that arrived on time. The story of the 17-pounder is more than an account of steel, ballistics, or design. It is the story of a nation that refused to let limitation become defeat. Britain in 1942 had fewer resources, smaller factories, and a population weary from years of bombing. Yet out of that scarcity emerged a weapon that reshaped modern armored warfare. For every gunner who served behind its breech, the 17-pounder was more than a tool. It was confidence made tangible. On the open plains of Normandy, in the forests of Holland, across the frozen Ardennes, its sharp report carried a message to both sides. Britain's engineers could still outthink the enemy. Each shot fired was a quiet act of defiance against the idea that only mass and metal decided victory. The weapon's success was rooted in collaboration. American industry built the tanks that Britain transformed. Canadian foundries supplied steel. Commonwealth gunners manned the towed versions that guarded the flanks of every Allied advance. The 17-pounder was a reminder that ingenuity thrives when necessity becomes desperate, when compromise is no longer an option. In post-war Europe, its impact continued. The gun armed Israeli Shermans in 1948, saw service in Korea, and trained generations of artillerymen who studied its design long after it left the field. The Firefly itself became a legend. The plain, boxy Sherman that killed tigers, a symbol of British adaptation that turned the tide of tank warfare. Decades later, military historians would still point to it as a moment where intellect triumphed over intimidation. It changed not just battles, but the very philosophy of design. Velocity over weight, precision over scale, speed over grandeur. It taught armies that a weapon's value lay not in its size, but in the minds that built it and the courage of the men who used it. At its core, the 17-pounder was a bridge between the desperate defense of 1940 and the victorious advance of 1945, between the cautious engineering of peacetime and the fearless improvisation of war. It connected a generation of men and women who refused to accept that Britain's best days were behind her. When the last Fireflies were scrapped and their barrels cut for metal, few of their crews watched without emotion. They knew what those long barrels had meant in the summer of 1944, when every inch of ground was earned at a terrible price. The gun had given them something intangible, belief. And perhaps that is why it endures, not as the largest or most famous of wartime weapons, but as the fastest to matter. In the race between time, technology, and survival, Britain's 17-pounder proved that intelligence, urgency, and what could still change the course of history.